This is Note-Taking Guide 2.6 for Math 2 class. We're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations by using square roots. So anytime we're solving for an equation, our very first goal is to isolate the variable. So if you look right here, the x squared is already by itself on one side of the equations. So the second thing we would want to do is we would want it to get it to be just an x instead of an x squared. And if we remember, in order to get rid of an x squared, we're going to do its opposite. Its opposite would be a square root, which is this right here. So in order to get the squared off of the x, we're going to square root both sides. When we square root both sides, the x squared becomes just x. But over here, we take the square root of 64, and normally we would just say that it would be 8, because that's what we've been taught since like 4th grade. But wouldn't it also be negative 8? Because negative 8 times negative 8 is still a positive 64. So you have to take into account these two numbers also that work. So my answers are going to be x equals 8 and x equals negative 8. Sometimes we just write that as x equals plus or minus 8 because it's positive 8 and negative 8. This next problem right here, again, we're trying to isolate the variable. We need to get this x squared all by itself. So in order to do that, the first thing I need to move is this negative 2. Negative 2 is times by x squared. So in order to get rid of something that's times by, we're going to divide by it because it's the opposite. So divide both sides by negative 2. It cancels over here, which is what we wanted to do. So we get x squared equals negative 25. The variable is isolated. Now we needed to get it just to be an x instead of x squared. So we're going to do the opposite of x squared, which is square rooting. So over here, the x squared square rooted becomes x because they cancel each other out. And on this side, we would square root the negative 25. When we square root a negative number, we remember that we always are just going to throw an I on for the negative and bring out the number's square root. So the square root of 25 is 5. Because of the negative, we're going to put an I on it. Also, we would do that for the other possibility, which would be negative 5i, because negative 5 times negative 5 would also still give you that 25. And then the negative underneath there is taken care of by the I sign. This one looks a little bit different than the last one again, but I like to just remember that my goal is to isolate the variable. So I need to get the x squared by itself. In order to do that, I need to move the 15. The 15 is positive, it's plus 15, so in order to move it to the other side, I'm going to subtract 15. It cancels over here because that's what I wanted it to do. And on that side, I am left with just x squared. And over on the other side, I have a negative 106 minus 15, which is a negative 121. I'm going to square root both sides now because the way I get x by itself is to get that squared off of it. To get the squared off, I'm going to square root. I'm left with x on this side. Because of the negative underneath the radical right here, I know I'm going to have i's on my answer. So I'll have 11i. And I will have negative 11i. Again, we could write that as x equals plus or minus 11i if you only want to have to write it once. Alright, this next problem has several steps in it, but again, our goal is to isolate the x squared. The x squared is attached to that 4 right now, so we got to get rid of the other junk first. How we get rid of a plus 18? We subtract it to the other side. So when we do that, it cancels over here, which is what I wanted it to do. And I'm left with 4x squared equals 900. I have to divide by 4 to get the 4 off of the x squared. When I do that, I have x squared equals 225. And then I'm going to square root both sides. When I square root 225, my x value is going to be positive or negative 15 because the square root of 225 is 15. Alright, this next one looks a little bit different than the last couple I did. We have our x plus 7 inside parentheses and then squared. So I can't really get rid of the 7 until I get rid of this squared out here. The squared is kind of my first priority just because of where it's at. So I got to get rid of the squared first. In order to do that, I'm going to square root both sides of my equation here. The squared and the square root cancel on this side to just be x plus 7. And then I'm going to square root 84 and put it on the other side. The square root of 84 is 2 square roots of 21. I just punched that in my calculator and let my calculator do the work. To get the x isolated now, I'm going to have to move the 7. The 7 is added, so I'm going to subtract it to the other side. And I get x equals negative 7 plus or minus 2 square roots of 21. And up here I should have reminded you that when we square rooted it, we get a plus or minus sign on whatever we square root, the positive of that and the negative of that. When we're talking about complex numbers, it's easier just to write up plus or minus in between the real and the irrational part of your number. Okay, this next problem is even more complicated than the last one because there's several steps to this. Again, you want to isolate the variable. The variable stuck inside here in the parentheses, so we're going to kind of just look at what's the furthest away from the variable, and that's this minus 2 right here. So we're going to get rid of the minus 2 first by adding it to the other side. So I'm left with 4 times x plus 5 squared equals 48. Now again, my variable stuck inside those parentheses, so I'm going to get rid of this 4. The 4 is times outside, so I'm going to divide it to the other side. The 4's cancel here, and I'm left with x plus 5 squared, and then the other side is equal to the square root, 48 divided by 4, which is 12. Now that I have my parentheses isolated, I need to get that squared off of my parentheses. So I'm going to square root both sides. When I do that, the squared and the square root cancel over here on this side to just x plus 5. And on this side, I'm going to have plus or minus 2 square roots of 3. What I did is I just punched the square root of 12 in on my calculator and got 2 square roots of 3. And then just a reminder that it's always the positive of that and the negative. So now one last step to isolate that x is just to subtract that 5 over to the other side. When I do that, I get x equals negative 5 plus or minus 2 square roots of 3. Another complex number solution. Here's another one that looks a little bit like that last one we just did. Again, when we have our x stuck inside the parentheses like that, we have to get rid of the junk that's the furthest away from it on the same side. So that would be this 5. To move the 5 to the other side, we're going to subtract it. So over here I'm going to have x minus 8 squared equals 85. My next job would be to get the squared off of the parentheses so I could get rid of the stuff in the parentheses. So to get the squared off, I'm going to square root. It cancels on this side to x minus 8. And on the other side, I need to find the square root of 85. When you punch the square root of 85 on your calculator, it does not simplify. It stays the square root of 85. So we're just going to leave it plus or minus square roots of 85 and finish solving for our x. To get x completely by itself now, we're going to have to do the opposite of minus 8, which is add 8 to the other side. It cancels on this side, which is what I wanted it to do. And on the other side, I'll have 8 plus or minus the square root of 85. Kind of an ugly answer, but that's what we're getting. Our last problem is again one of the hard kind where we're just going to do a lot of steps. Again, our x is stuck inside all of this stuff kind of attached together with that. The furthest away part from it is that plus 10. So I'm going to subtract 10 to the other side to get rid of the positive 10. So I have 5 times x plus 3 squared equals negative 50. My next job is to get that 5 off the front of the parentheses, so I'm going to divide both sides by 5. Cancels over here, and I'm left with x plus 3 squared equals negative 10. I'm going to square root both sides now to get rid of the squared on the x plus 3. And it cancels to x plus 3 on this side. On this other side, square root of 10 does not come out of the radical, but I do have to take out that I, so I'm just going to throw it back behind outside of my radical. And then the last step would be to minus the 3 over to the other side. And I'm going to write my answer as negative 3 plus or minus square root of 10 I.